Sorry about that. Thank you. Okay, well, that was good. We have a lot of concerned citizens, which is, and I think those of you who didn't identify that way probably do. So thanks again for being here. We're going to start off with Martha King. We have 3 co-chairs of this group. Martha is one, Maria is another, and Jamie Rubin is the 3rd co-chair. And Martha is going to give us a brief overview of GoVoteNYC before we hear from our speakers.
Yes, so that's my role. A little bit of background. So in early 2021, 12 New York City-based donors came together and came together very quickly to support nonpartisan efforts to strengthen civic engagement in New York City, both this year, but in the years to come. And the acute concern was the high stakes coming out of COVID, going into the new ranked choice voting system as we completely overturned the city's government. The deeper impetus was, decades-long decline in New Yorkers' civic participation and the past abysmal voter turnout, where regularly much less than a quarter of registered voters were participating in choosing our local leadership. And so thus far, those of us participating in GoVoteNYC are diverse in structure, including individuals, concerned citizens, and families, and institutions. And we're also diverse in terms of our areas of focus. So ranging from breaking the cycle of mass incarceration to supporting and strengthening the arts sector. But what we all came together in recognition of was that widespread democratic participation in the city was critical to each of these goals, from fighting climate change to the creation of more affordable housing, that we couldn't, nor could our grantees, make any lasting change on any of these issues without that. And what we have right now in New York City, frankly, in terms of participation, is not that. And so what we did was, in early April, GoVoteNYC got out nearly $1.2 million worth of grants, and we made grants to 9 organizations, primarily coalitions whose work was grounded in the evidence suggesting that voter engagement, voter education by trusted community organizations, trusted nonprofits who could integrate that work into community priorities would be most effective. And those groups really aimed to reach voters in New York City who hadn't been voting in the past. So young people, people living in immigrant dense areas of the city, and quite a few neighborhoods in the Bronx and some areas of Brooklyn and Queens with very low turnout historically. The coalitions that GoVoteNYC funded included 60 organizations with a presence in 200 neighborhoods and a goal of reaching close to 2 million New Yorkers. And so now the primary is behind us, and we're working hard to distill what worked, where, and why. But we do know that we had the highest turnout for a local primary in at least more than 3 decades, and nearly 3 in 10 registered voters participated. So that's good news, but it's still not where we want to be. And we have state and local elections ahead of us in 2022 and 2023. And so now we're turning our attention to the broader goal of making sure that we have a barrier-free system, a fair system here. Obviously, without that backdrop, and in particular, without a functioning Board of Elections operating with integrity, voter education, voter engagement can really only go so far. And so that's why I'm super excited to have this conversation today. And Laura, I hope I fulfilled my role, and I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. That's great, Martha. Thanks. That gives us all a good context. So now I'm happy to introduce our speakers. We're going to start with Professor Yanka, and in your introduction, thank you for sharing your credentials. But he is, as he said, a professor at Cardozo School of Law and an expert on all of these issues. So, Echo, get us started.
Well, thank you for having me, everybody. And it's just really nice to hear, Martha, you may have thought it was pro forma, but it's really nice to hear people who are committed to democracy's superstructure or the scaffolding. I know I often tease with some of my friends. Some of you I've known for many years or seen you regularly. And so when we get together, this is an issue of deep passion and excitement. When you're at a cocktail party and you want to talk about, election law and campaign finance reform, somehow it's not quite as scintillating to people. I just don't know why. But what I do, when people aren't kicking me under the table, what I do try to convince people of is why they should care about these issues. And in particular, now that I've been given the portfolio of public campaign finance, why they should care about public campaign finance. It's a standard line at these things, but it's still true that whatever your most important issue is, your second most important issue should be voting. Because while voting is not the only way we affect political change, it is the lasting way, and it is the way in which we cash out so much of the work, whether it be people protesting in the streets, whether it be people fundraising, whether it be people running for, all of these things so often have to be cashed out in voting. And so that's why it was a great honor for me now almost a year ago when Andrew Stewart Cousins and Carl Hastie reached out to me and asked me to join the New York's newly forming Public Campaign Finance Board. I won't bore you with every gruesome detail, but I'm the Democratic appointee, and I work alongside my Republican colleague, Commissioner Brian Cole. And I mention that because despite not being at all shy about my own political commitments, I think it's really important that people understand that this really is something that Brian Cole and I, and then eventually the governor's appointee, view as a public good, a nonpartisan public good. I am deeply, deeply convinced that if everybody voted, the issues I cared the most about would win out. But of course I'm convinced of that. I think they're the right positions. But so too is Brian Cole. And that's the way it should be. We should be convinced that if we can take our ideas to every voter, we can win a contest of ideas. And we have seen how dangerous and corrosive it is when instead of trying to convince voters of the rightness of our ideas, we try to shave away at the electorate instead to fit them to our policies. And so I think it's, in lots of ways, I have questions about bipartisan versus nonpartisan election reform. But what is true is that this committee is committed to it being, just to speak plainly, a kind of reform we can present to all New Yorkers proudly and confidently, with them knowing that this is not stacked in any party's favor. And working with my Republican colleagues has been, frankly, as much a joy as arguing with people over things in goodwill can be. And that's significant. So that's the nonpartisan approach that we care about. So now, the thing is, I promised I wouldn't do this to you too much, but why should we care about campaign finance reform? What are the instrumental reasons? Look, I think among the things that have obviously set the news media on fire is the hunger for change so often, right? The part of this is just a sort of feature of reporting, right? An upset is always going to be more interesting to report than continuation. AOC's brand is in part due to, I think, her charisma and her intelligence, but it's in part due to the sort of shocking nature of her winning. But the important thing about this to me is not who wins and who upsets and so forth. It's that it shows that there's been a hunger for new voices and new ideas. Whatever is true on lots of sides, lots of people are convinced that doing things the same way is not working. So then the question is, what stops people from getting involved? And here, I think campaign financing is utterly critical, both for instrumental reasons, but, and you'll forgive me, when you're a philosopher, when you're a professor of jurisprudence, you can't help but to reach for the philosophical reasons. I think as much as one tries to be practical, and I try when I'm in front of serious people to pretend to be all practical, but these things are not just practical. There are deeply non-instrumental reasons to care. We have seen what it looks like when people lose faith in our electoral system. The kinds of things that people like me have been going on, people like us, frankly. Martha, your introduction was spot on point. We've seen what it looks like when 75% of people in an election simply sit it out because they no longer care or they no longer believe that the politicians will represent them. We've seen what it looks like when people think the game is stacked and rigged only for the wealthy. They think politics is just a game where the wealthy divide political goods among themselves. They don't think their representatives would ever listen to them. And their reasons for thinking this are not bizarre, right? Campaign finance reform is deeply important to the health of our system. And that's true whether or not you want to kick everybody out or re-elect your favorite person. Now, why do I say people have lost faith because of public campaign finance? I know it's silly. You could pull 100 people off the street and most of them wouldn't know the name Citizen United. But they do understand the sense of it. They do understand the idea that it is the very wealthy that are allowed to either get access to or themselves run for office. And that sense has been deeply, deeply corrosive to our political system. There's a reason why it's shocking when Ms. Watson wins in Buffalo and upsets a longtime mayor, because there's just the sense that an ordinary person who has great ideas can't go out there and sell them to their neighbors and friends. As I said, the reasons people think this are not bizarre. I know we all know these stats. They're like mother's milk in this crowd, but they shouldn't lose their ability to shock us. In 2016, fewer than 5,000 donors provided over half of all the campaign funding for the presidential election. 5,000 donors across the country provided half of the funding in our presidential election. And the same is reflected in New York. In New York, the top 100 donors gave more to candidates than all of the 137,000 small donors give in any major election. And so that means it's not a vague sense that it's just the rich and the powerful that divide these things among themselves. People are well aware that unless you have a Rolodex, for those of you under 30, a Rolodex is what used to be a paper contact list in your phone. People have the sense that unless you've got a Rolodex full of multimillionaire friends, there's just no way you're going to run for office, right? I mean, you might think I know just as much or I'm just as convincing as that guy, but this kind of thing is not for me. At the same time, by the way, you're utterly convinced that even if you like your elected official, there's no way you could really bend their ear, right? I mean, you've got to pay something like $1,000 to go to a rubber chicken dinner in order to sit down and talk to them. And even when that's not true, the sense of that is corrosive and pervasive. And public campaign finance can help change that. So what's a better system look like? I could go through the details, but I think Chisan, who is so elegant at doing so, is going to give the nuts and bolts. By now I've got them all memorized, but I'll leave them to her. But just a broad overview. Under a better system, if an elected official knew that instead of being sensitive to the wishes of a very few group of people who fund their campaign, that small donations could be so amplified that they can run their election essentially by convincing a broad section of their constituents, it would change the way they govern and the way they run. It would change the way they campaign, and it would change the realm of possibility as to the things that they can offer and the arguments they can make. At the same time, by the way, not only would it make our current elected officials more responsive, but it would mean that Sabrina, Laura, Neil, or their counterparts sitting at their coffee table, having their 50th argument about why the school model is not working in this way, or why we should change the public transportation system in that way, can look up and say, I can take these ideas to my neighbors. If I can get a broad section of ordinary people to cut me checks for $25, $50, or $100, I would have enough money to challenge and run for office myself. So this is to make democracy broader and deeper, and it really does matter. But I'm going to close by going not just from the instrumental and hinting at the nuts and bolts, but going back up to my claim that this is more than instrumental, that this is intrinsically deeply important. If Neil, Sabrina, and Laura sitting at their table truly felt they could run for office, and if their neighbors felt that not only could they run for office, but that Neil, Laura, and Sabrina could run for office, we chip away at the corrosive attitude that politics is a game for the wealthy to divide things among themselves. If you know somebody who ran, somebody who won, if they're your neighbor, you can actually call them up, Or even if you just see it as an example, then you realize that governing really is the thing that we're meant to do together. It really is the thing we're meant to argue about together. And I think that has huge effects for who runs, who votes, who participates, who comes to meetings. I don't just say that lightly. I've seen it happen in institutions big and small. And when people feel like they really have a stake and they're involved, their wins are magnificent. The things they search for and win are magnificent, and their losses are more deeply and collegially shared. They feel like they had a hand even in the ways they lose. And surely we got to know that that's needed for our current democracy. I'll stop there.
Laura, is there room to ask a couple of quick questions, or do we want to finish up with our presentations?
Maybe we should finish up. Can you hold that thought?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much, Echo. It's such a, it's so great to have you with us, and we really appreciate your sharing all of that and your point of view. It's a lot of food for thought. And we're really fortunate to have two senior attorneys from the Brennan Center to continue the conversation. Chi-Sun and Joanna, you both introduced yourself well, so I'll save time. But just to say that in addition to their deep expertise locally, they're both involved in a lot of the national actions happening around the country. And so I think they can also help us understand how New York's challenges fit into that larger picture. So I'll turn it over to you two.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I think it's safe to say if everyone running elections in New York were as thoughtful and committed as Professor Janka, I don't think we'd be having this conversation today. So I can't tell you how thrilled we were after at the Brennan Center working for more than 3 years to get that reform enacted to democratize campaign finance reform in the state. That we heard he'd agreed to chair the new board overseeing that program. And I'm sure you're going to regret it many times over, Professor Janka, but thank you for doing that. And thank you all so much for your support and engagement in this work. We're so grateful to Julie and Martha and Laura for sharing the Brennan Center's conviction that fixing the institutions of our elections, especially in this moment, is absolutely essential and urgent. It's fundamental to our civic health, to social progress, to getting anywhere closer to the ideal of a truly accountable, participatory, representative democracy. That's why I love doing what I do. And I'm really thrilled to be here with two of my true comrades in arms for years and years, night and day, working on the struggle. So I want to just briefly give some background about the work the Brennan Center's been doing in coalition with some tremendous allies here to improve elections in New York and to shift focus a bit from campaign finance to voting and elections. I'll give some background on why we think the moment has come to finally tackle the beast that is the New York City Board of Elections. And then I'll turn it over to Joanna to give you the first preview anyone's getting of her remarkable report we'll be publishing in the next month or so about the Board of Elections. She'll unpack some of the reasons the board is so extremely dysfunctional and how it can be fixed significantly in the shorter term, and why deeper change could need a complete overhaul on the level of state constitutional amendment, which is no small proposition, though any real change is going to be an extremely tough battle. So, but I think it might be, I wanted to talk about very briefly why the Brennan Center, with all the work that we do across the country protecting elections and voting, includes New York election reform as a priority. We think that fixing democracy here in New York matters, first of all, in and of itself. We're home to 5.5 million voters. That's more than in half of the states in this country. And as Martha pointed out, we've got a history of really disappointing voter engagement and turnout. We're home to some of the toughest public policy problems facing this nation. Some of the deepest poverty is in the South Bronx. We've got some of the most inequitable public education, housing. We've got criminal justice problems that make national headlines. All of that, fixing all of that relies on creating a trustworthy electoral process that engages everyone and helps New Yorkers of all backgrounds to hold their public officials accountable. That's vital. But at the Brennan Center, we've seen how New York matters deeply in the national context as well. I don't think I need to tell anyone here, the nation is currently suffering from a deep crisis of confidence in our elections. Power and the volume of election disinformation and lies and accusations are exploding. The consequences aren't just voter apathy and checking out, but we've got racialized suspicion of groups among groups, and even violence. And the repeated failures here at the City Board of Elections only fuel that national narrative that people can't trust the electoral process. We just saw the former president making hay of the city BOE's snafu with the early ranked choice vote count. And that went all over the country, and I'm sure was amplified by many, many supporters who wanted to believe that was part of the narrative. But even before 2020, New York's problems served as an excuse for voter suppression in other parts of the country, usually purple states where outcomes could turn on voters of color. When we sued to stop restrictive voting laws in those places, we would hear in court, well, New York's a blue state. It's just as bad. So we here aren't doing this to be racist or partisan. Look at New York, bastion of progressivism. So what we're doing here in New York matters a great deal to protecting voting and elections here and everywhere. And obviously now more than ever. But right now is hardly the first time New Yorkers have said, the Board of Elections has reached its breaking point, something has to change, and then it doesn't, year after year, decade after decade. And we can see why, because changing it would threaten the very system through which those in power got where they are. And the way the system is structured puts control of that system in the hands of those in power who got where they are through that system. And Joanna is going to unpack that much more clearly than I can. So by no means do we think it'll be easy, but it's more possible now than ever before and more urgent now than ever. We think it's more possible because we've had the privilege and the pleasure of being one of the leading members of a remarkable coalition across the city and across the state. The Let New York Vote coalition that has, with the partnership of some deeply engaged civic leaders and supporters such as yourselves, and with some progressive elected officials too, we've really transformed voting laws in the state in just a few short years, really since 2019. From zero early voting, we went to what the Brennan Center for years was advocating as the gold standard of early voting, 2 weekends, 9 days before the election. We enacted automatic voter registration, modernizing our antiquated paper-based system that was really one of the worst in the country. We've restored the right to vote to people who have served their time in prison. We've even got same-day registration and no excuse absentee voting on the ballot to go before voters in November. And getting that passed, that's a different conversation, but I expect many of you will be engaged in that. And then a number of other technical fixes to fix some of the things that made no sense in voting in New York. And as part of the Fair Elections Coalition, which has like 95% overlap with Let New York Vote, we got the most progressive small donor match public financing program in the country passed in a state that everybody knows had the highest contribution limits in the state and dramatic inequality in who gave to elections and who was served by those who were elected to office. So all of this was possible because we worked arm in arm with a tremendous diverse coalition. It includes policy experts, yes, but also racial justice organizations, criminal justice reformers, youth activists like Generation Vote, which is helmed, I don't know how, in a parallel universe by our young colleague, Brianna Sia. We have disability access advocates working in coalition, housing access, healthcare, education reformers. It's a tremendous coalition that's really the living embodiment of what Professor Yanka was explaining, is understanding how systems reform is essential to achieving equity and progress and social justice on the issues that impact people every day of their lives. And we need to change the Board of Elections to reach the full potential, even just of the voting reforms that we've achieved over the past few years. We know, I think we can imagine same-day registration and what could go sideways with the Board of Elections that we have now. So these allies and the remarkably effective campaigns we've been able to wage together give us the hope and the drive and the momentum to think we need to tackle Board of Elections reform now. Just yesterday, we convened many of these allies to go over some of the key findings in Joanna's report and to talk about some of the policy solutions and start laying the groundwork for a possible campaign. So I want to turn it over now to Joanna to walk us through some of it. And, we'll ask for your patience and understanding because this really is the first, you're getting the first outside glimpse. So without further ado, Joanna.
Thank you, Chi-san, and thanks everyone again for gathering today. I'm really excited to share some of our findings and solutions with you. So I'll just say, to echo Chi-san, it's well known that when it comes to New York City elections, something is going to go wrong. This is just something that we've come to expect as voters. And I could go into a litany of examples of how things have gone wrong, but I think this is a group of people who've actually experienced themselves, from wondering, where is my absentee ballot? Did it count? My voter registration got thrown out, many others. So I'm really going to focus on the structural root causes that we've been examining. And that's really how the Board of Elections' insularity and lack of accountability to voters has perpetuated the system where problems just continue to occur and voters keep getting left out. As Laura said, we work on elections and study elections administration coast to coast. And we really thought we had seen it all, but once we started digging deeper in our research on New York, we were just shocked by how much worse the problems are in New York City than we had really thought, and in comparison to other parts of the country. A large part of our research has really been doing a national review and comparing administration in New York City to other equally populous and diverse jurisdictions across the country, like Los Angeles, Maricopa County, Arizona, where Phoenix and Scottsdale are, Harris County, Texas, where Houston is, and many other jurisdictions. And in comparison, New York is really a disaster when it comes to administering elections. And so to get a more participatory and representative democracy, we need to fix how that system works. Chi-san really laid out the stakes for why this matters so much in such a large and diverse city as New York. So I'm just going to dive into a sampling of the problems that we're focusing on in our study. One is just the sheer size of the board contributes to inefficiency. The City Board of Elections is run by 10 commissioners who are spread across 5 boroughs and 2 major political parties, which is something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. None of the top 15 largest jurisdictions come even close to having such an unwieldy and inefficient structure. Another issue is who gets in the door of the agency and how. We've learned, and this is like something that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but the number one qualification for employment at the board, from the commissioner level all the way down to the most junior staff, is connections to the county political parties. And this stems from, but is not actually really required by, the state constitution, which gives the two major parties a role in nominating commissioners and embeds the role of parties in elections administration. There's no requirement in the law that the people at the top of the agency receive any kind of training or even really have a passing interest in how elections are run. And obviously we want to have people at the table who really are committed to serving voters. There's also never a public process really for evaluating nominees to be commissioners and to lead the agency. We've seen a very small handful of public hearings over the years. The first one was held in 2014, but that was reported in the media as being a complete anomaly in a process that usually happens behind closed doors and is rubber stamped. And unlike other major metropolitan elections agencies that serve comparably large and diverse populations, there's not a national search or a public search for executive leadership, despite the size of the electorate. In fact, as many of you probably know, almost none of the jobs at the BOE are hired publicly. This is all stuff that happens behind closed doors. We've also found just how hard it is to address issues of incompetence at the board. The governor has the power to remove commissioners when things go grossly wrong, and this has never been used in the history of the Board of Elections, even through a trail of abysmal leadership cycle after cycle. And then just to pivot a little bit from the internal structures to how the board functions, we've noticed, we live in an information age where it's easy to collect data. It's easy to assess how operations are going and to plan ahead and do better next time. And this is something that elections officials across the country really put into practice. And this isn't something that really happens at the Board of Elections. It's very hard for the public to actually assess what's happening at the board, how quickly are operations happening, how are ballots being distributed on time, and getting that sort of information readily available is something that other places do really well, and just does not happen here. I don't think anyone's surprised to hear that. So what's been fascinating to me and to our team has been figuring out what are the things that we can do to fix these problems. So as Chisun said, we're prepared in the next month or two to release a report that lays out this information and some of our ideas for common sense, they almost sound obvious, short-term solutions that could provide a meaningful step forward. That includes addressing some of the structural issues of the board that are not enshrined in the Constitution, but would be more easily fixed through changes to the state election law, like reducing that unwieldy number of commissioners, which would be more in line with other jurisdictions and would help lift the board out of a structure that's really keyed to borough affiliation and party affiliation. We also recommend bringing more transparency and merit-based selection to the appointment process for those who are in the top ranks, the commissioners and the executive staff. That also includes conducting that national search I mentioned that doesn't happen right now. We would also recommend giving local authorities the ability to remove the commissioners in cases of malfeasance, because those are the folks who are most directly accountable to the voters of New York City. And as I mentioned, on the data collection front, we think that requiring the agency to track and publicly report key voting and elections administrative data would both enable the agency to assess its own performance and pivot and do better and improve its own internal operations, but would also help the public to hold it accountable. Academics and journalists and concerned citizens, like so many of the folks on this call, could make a meaningful difference if they have the tools they needed to actually pinpoint what was going wrong. So this is just a sampling. I could go on for much longer, but I'll say, of course, these solutions are not rocket science, but it still takes political will and a great deal of work by a lot of people who care to make them happen. As Shisun also mentioned, in the longer term, beyond these solutions that can be implemented quickly, there's still a lot more to do. There are problems across New York State, and we think that a number of our solutions would be equally applicable to other parts of New York State. Certainly there are unique problems elsewhere, but also, as my colleague previewed, real structural reform could go so far as requiring an amendment to the state constitution. That's a much longer process that would require passage in 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature and a referendum by voters, but would be what's required if it comes to be that really extracting the role of party involvement from elections administration is the deep down solution that's needed. So for both these short and long-term strategies, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's work to be done to persuade the public and to persuade lawmakers, and work to do in partnership with other groups, with civic organizations, and civic leaders like yourselves, to really show Albany that we can't keep ignoring this problem that, let's be honest, doesn't really hurt them because they keep winning in the same system. Of course, there are legislators who have introduced bills in the past session which have provided promising steps forward. But it's really time to draw more focus, build momentum. And I think the momentum is there. We saw the issues with the recent primary and the attention that it received. As Chisun said, not just in New York, it was something that folks were talking about all over the country. And it's created an opportunity and an urgency that really makes this work ever more important. So, there are going to be so many opportunities to engage in the months and years, frankly, to come. If everything goes according to plan within the Brennan Center, I think there's going to be a lot of work for us to do with policy analysis, bill drafting and feedback, public explainers, and really engaging with the public to show why this matters so much. So if you can't tell, we're really excited about this work. It's really energizing and it's of the moment and it's ever more meaningful. So we're grateful to be able to do it and to be able to share it with all of you. So thank you for your time and attention today. And I know, Laura, you wanted to leave time for questions and discussion, and we're eager to hear folks' reactions and what you're all thinking right now. And of course, happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you both. That was a really great overview and also a lot of detail. So appreciate that, tackling both. I know we want to have some time for questions. I'm going to ask if you raise your hand, but we'll start with Jamie because I know you had one earlier. But then you can use the, raise your hand icon and I'll call on you and unmute.
Unmute. Did I unmute?
You did. You're on.
Hey, how about that? Awesome. So thanks for all of that from all three of you. And there's a lot there, obviously, and I recognize that it's all, everything that we're hearing from you all is pointing in the same basic directions. I was going to ask a question, but I think I'm going to instead, because there was so much to respond to, I'm just going to make a point, and then maybe Laura, you can either treat it as a question and let somebody respond, or just you can move on to the next person who has a real question. You know, the Go Vote New York City, the convener of this discussion, focused not really on any of the issues that you all just raised. As you know, I mean, we really didn't get it, unless I was absent the meeting. We didn't talk about we didn't address campaign finance reform at all. We didn't address the BOE for obvious reasons, because there wasn't, I mean, that was way outside the remit. And we didn't address, well, I guess that's kind of where we, you know, that's where we are. We focused very intently on voter registration and get out of the vote, which was the goal. And I guess my reaction to everything that I just heard from you all, which much of which I agree with, is that I still think we had the right focus. And the reason I say that is because I'm very jaded and cynical, having worked, you know, most recently for the governor for 5 years and also at other places in government, and spent a lot of time in Albany. And around national politics as well. And I've just come to think that the issues that we focused on, frankly, were the ones that were the most direct route to fixing whatever these problems are. I think the BOE is obviously a freaking disaster. And so, Joanna, it sounds like your report sheds a lot of light on that, and I laud you for it. I'd be interested to hear what your strategy is for getting it fixed, because I think if you have to go through Albany, one of my mentors in state government used to refer to Albany as the place where dreams go to die. And this is one in particular that I suspect that you could start digging a grave for right now, just to be very honest with you. I mean, I think you need champions way beyond what you're going to find. You know, if there's a litigation strategy, I'd be interested in hearing about that, because I think that's a much more direct route. Campaign finance reform is something that I think is interesting. I'd be curious to hear why you think that the people that spent the most money in the most recent New York primaries are the ones that lost the most egregiously. I think there are real issues with money in politics, but I think it has less to do with running the races than it does to do with influence on elected officials. But that's, you know, they're obviously very related, so that's the thing. But I just think that registration and getting out the vote is the one thing that, you know, money can help with, but fundamentally it's about organization and shoe leather and effort. And if we can fix that problem and figure out how the hell to get people to vote, then a lot of other stuff will be, and I'm not naive, there's all kinds of other issues around redistricting and everything else, but it's a very complicated system. But I just feel like what this GoVoteNYC effort focused on, and I think Laura and Martha and team did a great job of it, is fundamentally the most direct solution to the problems that we have. And I guess, I don't know if I have anything else to say, or if anybody wants to comment on it, or just let it go, but that's sort of my reaction to this, having heard all these things. I mean, I think you all are tackling the biggest, most kind of difficult, abstractest issues, but that require so much to remedy them. And I've just become a fan of direct action, because I think that so much else falls against a brick wall.
Okay. A lot to respond to. I don't know. Would any of our speakers like to respond? Chisun? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for raising a lot of the skepticism that we've heard over many years. I am no Albany insider, but I do know that we made a lot of dreams come true in Albany that people said would never happen. So the laws that I just listed happened in the past few years. And there was no secret formula to that, but broad, strategic, unified coalition work, campaign strategy, and a ton of fighting. And I think it's absolutely true that civic engagement and voter participation are essential. Those are the goals. But to get there, people need to feel that there's a reason to bother. That the process is, first of all, going to count their votes fairly, that they'll be able to cast them in the first place, and that the voting is going to beget a government that is going to hear them and respond. So structural change and fixing the Board of Elections and the goals of robust civic engagement and voter participation are inextricably entwined. And I know this is not a conversation about campaign finance, but it's just an issue that I'm personally fascinated in my professional capacity. The idea that there's been this very popular narrative that, well, there's big money in the city elections, but the big money didn't win. So there's a sort of counterfactual belief that, well, so campaign finance reform doesn't matter. But I think what's amazing about that is that happened in the context of the nation's longest standing, most robust small donor matching funds program. And when you look at the incredible progress in city council among women, among people of color, among women of color, and you see how were they even able to run and where did their support come from? When we have Hazel, my colleague here, is part of leading crunching the numbers, you see how much more women and people of color rely on the support of small donors, really their neighbors and voters, to be able to even get their message out there. So to us, this is confirmation that we have to keep on innovating and broadening the systems of access to elections and winning office and representation if people are going to feel like this is the government and the system that belongs to them. It sounds hokey. So I may be the naive, counterpoint to the cynical insider, but we are seeing these things happen in real life and been a part of it. So we've got to keep going.
Yeah, look, sorry, I don't want to hog the airway. I'll just say one quick thing, and then Laura, I'll let you go to the next. I saw Pat had her hand up, and she always has thoughtful stuff to say, so I don't want to stop it. I don't disagree. In fact, I agree with you in particular about your point about the value of the small donor matching. I mean, I was just full disclosure, I was very involved in one of the mayoral campaigns, not the winning one, and that relied very heavily on small donor matching, and I think that sort of makes the point that. In the context, at least of New York City and maybe New York State, campaign finance reform is interesting and important, but not really the problem, because we do have a system that actually works, modestly well for the reasons you said.
To be sure, I mean, just to jump in, to be sure, we just now built the same system for New York State. So I mean, I as is so often the case, I can hardly say things better than Chisan did. But look, let me just say two quick things. I don't remember when I met Laura Wood, but it's got to be over a decade ago. And I say that because one of the things I remember, I was lucky enough to be invited to one of the bill signings with the current governor. And it wasn't that it was so glamorous to be in a bill signing. It's that when I looked up, I remember thinking, oh, wow, there's Laura. Oh, wow, there's this person. There were so many people who I'd seen, let's say 3 times, 5 times a year for a decade. And so to your point, James, I don't disagree that this stuff is hard and slow and molasses. Dreams go to die. But, zombie movies are about the dreams that won't quite go away, right? The creatures you can't quite kill. Put differently, I think we overestimate, as the line goes, what we can accomplish in a year, but we underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade. And I really, truly remember when all the things that are law now were things we were talking about at meetings and people laughed at them as utopian. And now we've gotten them done, including campaign finance reform. And lastly, I'll say, look, I mean, my family came from, my mom, I was born here, but my mom comes from Ghana, West Africa. And I was raised with this kind of idea that if I went to school and worked hard, I could accomplish lots of different successes, right? And that's been a real gift. But here's the odd thing. Despite lots of great things happening in my life and lots of academic accomplishments, which led to a few other things, I never had the same feeling about politics. There was just this feeling that politics was something that other people play. And so I only bring that up to point out that the corrosiveness of feeling that some game is impenetrable because it is only for certain people to divide amongst themselves is a serious one. And it is amazing to me how much time and energy we spend decrying that in lots of other fields, right? It is a constant national conversation that is corrosive when it comes to education or jobs. But somehow we're fine with that being the default instinct of everybody in politics. And then we're surprised when people on all sides grow apathetic, exit, or revolt.
Okay, thank you. So Pat, let me move to your question.
Hi, so I'm I'm picking up on Jamie's observation and our dilemma, of this notion of direct action, i.e., getting people excited about voting again, versus this sort of policy wonky things that we've talked about this morning. And I just want to say that it's not an either or. Lots of the reforms that Shisan talked about partly happened because on one track you had advocates coming together from all different, the disability rights advocates and the, human justice, all of them coming together and pushing for this over many years. And then you also had political change in Albany that was the result of people coming out and voting. And we actually had a considerable, flip in the state legislature that also made it possible. So these things have to come together. It doesn't negate the problem that we as funders have, which is that our resources are limited. We have to be as strategic as possible. And so we can't be all things to all people. So we have to kind of figure out where is it that our injection of resources and technical support can make the biggest difference. And so if there is time, I would love to hear some of our speakers talk to, not that we need you to figure that out for us entirely, but it'd be great to have any insight that you might have on how we as funders with the resources we have can make the most difference.
Any of our speakers want to take a stab at that, or other members of the group have thoughts on this?
Well, I could speak to, I've spoken a lot. So if anyone else would rather take it, just wave, cut me off. So I am no expert in philanthropy, but I guess I could talk a little bit about what it has taken to get as far as the coalition and campaigns have. The coalitions haven't just been a collective of passionate organizations linking arms. There have been the things that various members and supporters, including some crucial ones on my screen here, have invested in are sophisticated media communications and strategy resources like digital media operations. There have been grants to membership organizations and organizers to be able to go out in their memberships and educate and get people galvanized and start bridging some of this very common, understandable knowledge gap about, why should I care about the Board of Elections or money in politics? I'm trying to get fair housing. And those efforts have been remarkable. There's, of course, like an extraordinary amount of policy work, legislative drafting, briefing and educating legislators in Albany. What's wrong? How can it be fixed? And we often get, well, can you just draft it for us and show us? And where are you getting the information you're getting? So there's research. So there's a tremendous amount of disciplined work that goes into it. And then, of course, just being able to focus on New York priorities when there are many other priorities out there. And for some of our local community-based organizations, being able to focus their time on electoral reform, voter education, civic engagement, alongside their core work, which can be community service. It might be helping with post-conviction relief, that sort of thing. And for them to be able to devote their really limited time and people power to joining with us on working out strategies and speaking on these issues and figuring out how to embed them in the work that they're doing are all real needs and real work that have happened in the past years that we've been involved.
Jason, can I just add one thing to that, which is on the last set of victories you all had in 2019, the Brennan Center organized a pretty powerful and significant group of business leaders, corporate leaders in New York to carry the same message in those communities. And what was so striking about that was that this is an issue that everybody can get around behind, because we've all suffered the indignities of waiting for 3 hours online to vote, or, you know, not getting our absentee ballot or whatever. But it became something that people who have divides in this town could actually coalesce around. And that was done very successfully in that last set of laws. And, you know, if you could just comment on that, because I do think that the business community, the corporate community in New York is an essential player in this story.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about that, Julie. So this was an incredible and unusual coalition, which we called New York Lead, of business leaders, civic leaders, former public officials. And this is not a naive or a bunch of activists. It's a group of people who care deeply about fixing a lot of the systemic problems we're talking about for many reasons, partly because they have experienced some of the flaws of the Board of Elections themselves, but also because doing business or trying to lead in an atmosphere of cynicism and apathy, and people thinking, as Professor Yanko's saying, that there's a game that's rigged that excludes them, is not good for anybody. The culture of and the history of corruption in Albany was bad for good businesses who were doing everything they could to be by the book, but still suffering from the atmosphere. And we had some corporate members who really just hated the inefficiency of government, where things are so loose and dysfunctional that sometimes the inside track was the way to get something done rather than the merits or having good corporate policy. So this was a remarkable coalition and is a remarkable coalition that would, you know, between us, pick up the phone and call elected leaders they supported and say, this is really important, not just to community activists on the ground, but to those of us who want to be proud to do business here and to be known as a civic leader here. You have to help get this done. And that was a powerful influence, sometimes in the form of public op-eds in newspapers and letters to the editor. But, you know, we all know how things work here in New York, and it's very powerful for people who don't always have a personal reason to have to do this, to have a civic and citizenship-based reason to reach out and do this. So that's been encouraging to us also for many years.
Can I don't want us to run too far, but I could just pick up on a comment you just made, which I thought was really powerful.
Echo, can I interrupt you really quick?
Sure.
I want to hear what you're saying, but I also want to give people who really need to leave, you know.
Yes, of course.
Feel free to step off and we'll all catch up later. But so yes, go ahead.
So I just wanted to pick up on your point that so many of us can circle around these important issues because we've experienced the indignities of these things together, right? That it cuts across so many of our issues. And I just mentioned that because, you know, sometimes people ask me, well, why is it that you work on these issues, right? My core work is in criminal law, and policing is my theoretical work. And political theory, of course, is part of it. But it's because when I was doing things in non-academic circles, it turned out, as Chisan has just pointed to, that after people got all the ideas together, there was always the question of how to get this actually cashed out, how to get this written into law in Albany, and how to move it forward. And that was true when we were talking about policing, housing, racial justice issues. Every time I was involved in a conversation, then there would be the question, okay, so how do we then turn this into, you know, and Chisan's put it politely, but, you know, hey, can you draft this up now? Let's get this into a law, right? And so when you're asking, where can you intercede in ways that matter? I think it really does matter when people with, again, the Rolodexes and the connections keep pressing elected officials on the structures that matter in terms of the board of, you know, things that seem even boring to them, right? The things that they want to put on the back burner, and make it clear to them the connection between these things and the things that seem most pressing in the headlines, right? The protests over policing, in the end, were debates about how we change policing practices on the ground, including the laws that are written in New York about policing practices. Those are cashed out in votes eventually. The protests over NYCHA, and on and on and on. And lastly, you know, I think we'd be remiss to not point out that these things have corrosiveness that are not equally spread. When people see long lines of certain people, African-American communities, Hispanic communities, and those people are still waiting in line to vote at 9 p.m., there's a kind of feeling it's okay if that community doesn't vote. It's not for nothing that people descended on Detroit and Atlanta and Philadelphia with guns to stop people from voting, because there's the kind of sense that certain communities, their votes are inherently suspicious. And that's part of the reason we have to fix the Board of Elections. The default just ought to be that everybody votes, rather than, oh, if Philadelphia votes, something has gone wrong. And so, you know, I know that's a broad answer, but I tend to think interceding in the structure has, as I've said over and over, both instrumental but global reach and global fixes that just couldn't be more important.
Well, that's a great place to end this conversation. And I think you've all given our group a lot to think about. And I think we're going to have kind of a lively discussion when we debrief. So thank you, all three of you, Joanna, Chisan, Professor Yanka, so appreciated that you spent this much time with us, and for all of your insights. And Martha, do you want to wrap us up?
Well, thank you to everyone. I mean, I think this was exactly the kind of conversation we wanted to have. It really parsed out a lot of the questions and debate we need to have internally, both about what is needed and what is possible with more philanthropic support and more civic support. So surfaced the issues, more to discuss, and we have a conversation next week, next Friday, that will focus also, go back to sort of the initial work we've been doing, thinking about voter engagement in different ways. But I really, as you probably know, my bias is towards the structural change here. And so I'm very pleased that we had this discussion, and thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
Have a great weekend, everyone, too.
You too.
thank you. Bye-bye.